So hi again, I'm Michael Liben, Oxford Computer Group. I'm the principal consultant. And today's agenda, we're going to look at ways to onboard new hires without having to convey the user's password. We'll discuss the various methods where we can leverage Microsoft Azure Active Directory. We'll review the available authentication methods for self-service password reset, and then we'll give some ways of doing this with the REST APIs using Graph Explorer, PowerShell, and the new Microsoft Graph PowerShell module. Okay. Little word about Oxford Computer Group. We specialize in identity and security. We call it identity-driven security. Oxford Computer Group's been around for 19 years. We're very experienced with the Microsoft Identity Platform, starting way back with Microsoft Identity Integration Server, all the way up to the future of MIM. We're very good at Azure Active Directory and provisioning. We've done mailbox migrations, etc. We've been a partner of the year with Microsoft for 8 years, and we've become a partner of the year for Savient, which is a identity governance solution. We have been partnering with Microsoft for Entra, the new version of everything they have with the platform. And not only do we plan and assess, we also help deploy. And we've recently started a managed services group for those who need that particular service and don't want to have as much of their identity platform managed on premises. Okay, so a big challenge that we have, and most companies have, is new users must change their password at first login. It's a common company policy. The big catch with this is a user needs to authenticate to the system before they could change their password. And of course, they need to know their password in order to authenticate. So the real challenge is how can we securely convey an initial password to new users? And companies have struggled with this for many years. So the most common way of dealing with that is to, sorry, we got a little glitch at this end. The most common way is to sit there and send the user their password via email. Some companies don't want to send passwords via email. There's company policies that say email must not contain. There are ways where you can encrypt email and send them to the users, but you have a lot of difficulty for end users to decrypt those passwords. Another option is to send text via mobile telephone. Some feel SMS is not a secure method of messaging because it can be hacked, although in this case the risk of compromise is probably quite low, since SMS is usually attacked as a phishing exercise and new employees may not be that well known. Another option is to send it to the manager. And this is commonly used. However, there are cases where the manager is just not available. They might be on vacation, traveling for business, or, as most managers are, in meetings all day long. That may lead to downtime for the new hire. Another option is to send it to the service desk, but the immediate problem there is, how does the service desk identity proof a new user? That is, how do they know the person at the other end of the telephone is who they claim to be? Another aspect of service desk is most companies are looking to reduce the service desk calls because they're quite expensive, and it's one metric that they pay attention to carefully. Okay. And a voice call, which is effectively the same thing as a service desk, although a voice call could go direct to the user, is you're going to have difficulty automating that. And again, how are you 100% sure the person on the other end of the phone is who they claim to be? Another strategy that companies pursue is to come up with a pre-computed password via a formula. Either they'll send a timely one that's a common password. They'll send, I'll call them generics here. they might send, hey, it's fall 2022 with an asterisk at the end, so we'll meet the complexity requirements. But again, that's a shared password, and that's easy to hack. People will know it. Another one is to use a common format of information the end user knows, such as their first initials followed by their date of birth. We have two examples there. Unfortunately, when you put a date of birth into the password, it's personally identifiable information that should be private. You do potentially expose the system to existing auditing, and quite honestly, it's information that the identity management system just does not need to know. So Microsoft, what we're going to do here is we would try to leverage Microsoft self-service password reset. Okay. The advantage of a password reset as opposed to a password change is you don't have to know password. However, we do need to authenticate the end user in order to do that. With Microsoft 365, we do have the ability of pre-registering certain authentication methods for a user, so that we can actually just send the user the link and say, here, go to Microsoft 365 and log in, and go through that. But if we register an email or a phone number, mobile phone number with them, then they can actually execute a self-service password reset on their own. We do have other methods. We have a text message one, which I'll discuss later. That's newer. It's just come out of preview. And that one's interesting because you don't even have to tell the user their username. We also have the opportunity of using a temporary access pass, although at the end of the day, we do have to send a password to the user so they can use a temporary access pass. The remainder of the mechanisms shown here on the list are not things that we can pre-register. Those are things that the user pretty much has to register on their own. So while I have them on the chart, we'll skip over them and move on to the next methods. Okay, this is just a quick chart. It shows what Microsoft considers the strength of various authentication methods, and it's just shown for representative. Microsoft is pushing for the column on the far right to go for passwordless. Right now, we'll effectively be dealing with the password and SMS voice column is really where we're playing for the moment. All the others require an actual token or something else to be registered. Okay. And again, this is just another one over here showing the various authentication methods that you can use to log into Azure Active Directory. It's another comparison over here which talks about security, usability, and the like, different parameters. Some of this is a bit subjective based on Microsoft's criteria. So you may feel that you want to change things at your end. Okay. These are the authentication methods that are available for password reset, self-service password reset, which we talked about earlier. And something here, some of these have to be pre-registered if the users are going to use this. I'll note at the bottom that the security questions cannot be set administratively. They have to be set by the end user, so they're not over here. So we're going to deal primarily, again, with email, mobile phone. Office phone is primarily for tenants with a paid subscription, and we're dealing with a new hire who may not know their office phone, so it's not valid at that point. Okay. These are the authentication methods that are available. Combined registration is what I need to talk about. So recently, Microsoft has come up and decided that users were registering information for MFA and then registering the same information for self-service password reset. So Microsoft introduced the concept of combined registration. This allows users to manage their registration information in one place. It was found confusing that users would have to go to two places to enter the information and change the information if they ever needed to update it. So now we have combined registration methods. Users go to one place and it's shared both MFA and with self-service password reset. And I'm just waiting for the screen to catch up over here. All right, if you are going to use combined registration and you have older tenants, and this may have changed, Microsoft, I think, made this default for everybody at the end of September. But if you have an older tenant, basically an older tenant is anything that's created more than 2 years ago, which I imagine most on the call have, you do need to make sure that combined security is enabled. So this is just a map where you go to in the Contoso security settings and make sure that it's enabled if you want to use it. Also, while you're there, we do want to set the various authentication methods that are in use inside your tenant. Of particular use here, we do want to look at, we do want to set up, consider setting up the text message. It says preview here, but it's no longer preview, it's general availability. Microsoft has been biding their time removing the preview tag. And we also have the ability for a temporary access pass, which we'll talk about in a bit. Microsoft is now pushing certificate-based authentication, which I haven't enabled in this tenant yet, and it's really not required for what we're going to be doing with self-service password reset. In order to use a certificate, the users, of course, will have to have one registered to their device and such, but it is available. Okay. When we're doing password reset, setting up password reset, excuse me, we do want to keep track of the number of authentication methods that are used. Most tenants have a default configuration of one, and for some customers, that's fine. We do have other customers that insist on 2 authentication methods. So what will happen here is that the user will register, will come in, they'll sign in for the email, they'll want to change the password, they'll also have to provide their mobile phone number and get a number that they'll have to enter. So that just raises the security level for what you do, and this is where we handle the setting. Here I just show that email and mobile phone are both enabled as the methods. Additional methods can be used, but again, it doesn't necessarily apply to new hires. Okay. Like anything else that's up in Azure, we could set it. We can limit who can use the settings to a certain group, or we can set it for all. I imagine most tenants probably have self-service password reset enabled for all, but having the ability to select it is good if you're in a pilot mode as you're transitioning and getting the users in. You know, that was a very common setting that we've done, but nowadays it seems everybody's got all. If you are using some other self-service password mechanism and need to migrate it, this is another reason to limit the properties. Okay. Now, the authentication methods that are available on a user can be managed by administrators. So you'd have to be a global administrator or an identity administrator. And we can actually set individual methods on the end user. Here, we're going to show you how to do it manually, but in reality, we would be handling this programmatically, which we'll show some examples in PowerShell in a bit. Again, I'm apologizing. Okay, so here we have the various authentication methods. So here we're looking at Annie Hayworth, who's a person in my development tenant. And we'll see Annie already has a telephone number shown, and that's her only authentication method. And if we want to look at the details, we can just sit there over on the right, hit the ellipsis, the ... give us the ability to view, edit, or delete. Okay. So Annie, here's an example for Annie where we've added a whole bunch of authentication methods. We're looking at one of them over there. An important thing to see on this view is we actually have to, we have 2 phone numbers over there, but we can't tell the difference between the 2. We actually have to open the details button to see that the phone type here is mobile. Phone numbers are particularly challenging because you can have an office phone, you can have an alternate mobile in this case, but we see email and Annie has a temporary access pass, in which case she has one method there. Now, all of these are set administratively by the user. So once the phone number is registered and once an email is registered, if Annie comes in and just goes, hey, I forgot my, logs into Azure, gives the username, which we'll have to know, which would be Hayworth at, in this case, libendev.onmicrosoft.com. We go in, she would enter one of these numbers at the prompt. She would select, and that would let her come in and she could reset her password. Okay. If you want to add an authentication method, we go in, we actually have a button there to add the authentication method, and from there we choose the kind of method we are. So we could set up an email, phone number, temporary access pass. If we do go into phone number, we have to further specify what the type of the phone number is. Okay. So here we gave Annie an email over here, and we're just setting up an email address, in this case, the unknown domain yourmail.com, which sounds like an interesting domain someone should register. Okay, here we've got the two mechanisms registered for Annie, and we get to display the two. And I'm apologizing a little bit for the lag in my screen in the presentation, so if you hear some gaps, bear with me. Okay, and this is an example of the three types of telephone numbers you have. And we have a mobile, an alternate mobile, and an office. One word about adding telephone numbers and doing the formatting is Microsoft has a very, very strict requirement of, you'll see in red over there, following the format, which is going to be a plus, followed by the country code. This is for the United States and Canada, and then the remaining digits of a telephone number. There aren't much validation checks beyond what you're seeing over there, but it is a requirement that you have the plus followed by a country code, and that'll be important even if you do this programmatically. So here we see that Annie has two phone numbers over there. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to tell the difference between the two. So we'll go to the, we'll see again, we'll click on the piece. You'll see it highlighted in lavender in the middle of the screen. We get to switch between experiences. This is currently, this one is showing the old experience here where we can actually see what the phone number type is on the screen. I have put in a request to Microsoft to try to get that updated on their regular screen. So this is what would happen here. So the user would do their initial logon. They'd go to my apps or .microsoft.com, enter their username, user principal name. In this case, I blocked it a little bit in an earlier version because I didn't want to reveal my tenant name, but it's there. So they do need to put that in because can't access their account is not going to help them too much. So when they get to the link, they're going to then put in, they'll have the username, and then they'll have to enter the password they don't know. So they'll click on the Forgot My Password link, which will redirect them to the self-service password reset experience. Okay. Of course, once they get in over there, they'll have to get in and get past the CAPTCHA. So they'll have to enter their username yet again. I've never seen that carry over. Then they'll have to solve the puzzle for the CAPTCHA. And once they're there, they should be presented with, here's the screen to get back into your account. So they get to choose between the two methods, email me my alternate email at my alternate email, or text my mobile. Once they do select it, they get a hint of what the email address is or the mobile phone number. They'll have to enter the entire phone number to prove that they know it. But once we get back in there, they'll get to the, hey, get back into your account. So everything's been successful at this point. They'll be prompted to enter a new password as well as a confirmation. The password they enter here has to meet your organizational policies if you have on-premises. And Azure Self-Service Password Reset already knows how to do that. And then, of course, once they're in, it's been reset, and then they'll have to go in and sign in with the new password. So the user, without knowing the password, has gone to Azure, and they've set their initial password without, I'm sorry, not their initial, they've reset their password without having to know what that initial password is. So that's a nice convenience. Okay, so administrators can manage individual authentication methods. This is the big takeaway over here. And these are other things that administrators can do, including revoke sessions. Now we're going to look at SMS-based authentication, and this one is kind of nice. It's the new feature where the user does not have to know their username. Okay, so when they log in, they're prompted for their username, and what they end up doing is they just put their mobile phone number in. Once they do that, they'll get an authentication request to their mobile phone number, prompting them for a six-digit code that they need to enter to validate that they are who they say they are. And once they've done that, then they authenticate, and they can go to the Azure welcome page, and from there they can see what their username is, well, their user principal name in this case, without having to know it. So this is potentially quite useful. And you know, when you're sending a notification to the user, introduction email, you could just say, hey, go to this link, enter your phone number, and they'll get in. So that's another way of avoiding passwords. And in this case, you don't even have to send them the username. Now, SMS-based authentication does have some limits on what you can do with it. So basically, once they're in, you'll just want them to go and go to the self-service password reset and reset their password. And it's enough for them to do. SMS authentication, once they're in, is not compatible with multi-factor authentication, and it doesn't work with federation, which, if you think about it, makes sense because the user has not logged in with an account name that your on-premises Active Directory would know. You know, they would have to go in, so they'll get in. Once they change their password, they'll have to re-authenticate, and at that point, they'll re-authenticate with their new username and their new password, and then they've got a good login. To enable SMS-based authentication, we'll have to basically go to the control panel, just enable it. And again, for SMS-based authentication, we can either set a distribution group or a user, or both, actually. So we can add them in. So here we have Margaret Drysdale and Marion Crane. And if you're a fan of popular culture, those names will look familiar to you. And, oh yeah, and on there you'll see that it says preview on the settings over there, but it is general availability. And here is just an example of setting someone up for SMS-based authentication, and this literally comes from Microsoft document in their example. So here we have Bala Sandhu. We're going to add an authentication method. We're going to set up the phone number over there. We're going to set the phone number and phone number type. And then, of course, Bala, as we discussed earlier, Bala then goes to Microsoft to sign in, enters the phone number as the username, then clicks next. Users prompted, they have to enter the code. So they're going to be texted a code to that phone number. So they have to go retrieve the code that was sent to them by SMS, enter the code, and of course, once they've done that, then they're in. Okay. Now we'll look at temporary access pass. So temporary access pass is a time-limited passcode, but it has to be configured by an admin. Excuse me. It does meet strong authentication requirements up in, so that will allow users to change their MFA settings and SSPR settings. It's particularly useful if you want to recover a FIDO2 key that may have been lost. Okay, so for a temporary access pass, we need to enable it. Okay, and again, similar to the other methods, we need to go to the control panel, to the tenant panel, and enable it. And again, we have all users or select users. You may, since temporary access pass is special use, you may want to have this go to select users rather to all, just because you may want to revoke it. Well, the temporary access pass will expire at some point, so you want to do. These are the various settings for temporary access pass, And what we're going to do is we're going to set organizational parameters over here. Everything shown right now is the default 1 hour, 8 hours to do. But that establishes the parameters for the organization. Okay. Now the important thing is what you will do is, not the important thing, what you will do is you'll set a temporary access pass for individual users. So we've pre-done the global users. The others have a lifetime of 1 hour. So you just want to discuss with your internal security folks what we're going to do. Some important things over there is the minimum lifetime must be less than the maximum. If you are doing certain things like changing your registration, temporary access pass minimum is 10 minutes, and certain things must be achieved within those 10 minutes. So this is a comparison of all the authentication methods that presented over here that we would want to use. Mobile and email are probably the easiest for everybody to do and probably be done by most. Temporary access pass is a special situation. It does require administrative configuration, although it can be automated via PowerShell, so it's not as difficult. And SMS is probably my favorite, SMS-based, because the user just can log in and doesn't even have to know their username. So none of these require the user to know the password, other than temporary access pass will have to convey something. So between mobile, email, and SMS-based, those are probably the best options to use for any kind of automation of new people, of new hires. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we do the authentication methods using Microsoft Graph, Graph Explorer in particular here. So the first examples will be just showing what we've done in Graph Explorer. If you're like most of the people I work with, they are struggling with the Graph API. And here's a link at the top. For example, you won't be able to read it, but so this is a way of reading the phone registrations from Microsoft Graph. And there you'll see we had 2 phone registrations. We had one for a mobile phone and one for email. So here we could see the email methods. I'm sorry, we had 2 phone. Sorry, I got confused. We had 2 phone methods before, an alternate phone and a mobile phone. So now we have modifying reading. The email methods from Graph Explorer. So we'll have the URL at the top with the endpoint. You'll notice that the user's name is part of the URL. So when we call this particular endpoint, the blob that's returned underneath is going to give us the email address. That ID number, that 3DDFC, is actually the Azure ID, object ID for Annie up in Azure. So that's why it's coming up. Even though we like to use, user principal names because they're easy to read, Azure, Graph, and everything just really like to have that ID in there. Curiously, you can actually read password methods that are up there for Graph, and just about everybody will have a password method registered, but it's not particularly useful. The password will never be shown to you and never come back. But it is useful if you look at some of those date parameters over there to see if the method has been set on the user. And just as we can read information from Graph, we can also update information. We just changed the method on the upper left from get to post, and we have to give a body, which would include the user's ID and the email address that we want to set it to, and just send that off. And if all goes well, we've achieved it. So now we're going to do a more common method over here, which a lot of people would know would be the PowerShell invoke REST method way of doing it, which is going to look somewhat similar to what we're doing in Graph Explorer with some of the parameters and such. I'm just going to get into some more advanced things over here. So the first thing is we're going to need to authenticate into Graph, and this over here is an example that uses an application ID and a client secret that you will set up if you set up a automation in your Azure tenant. This is actually the older way of doing it. Whoops, I just lost the screen over there. This is the older way of doing it with the client secret. Microsoft is pushing very, very hard for everybody to use certificate-based authentication. And over there we make the call. I do parse out what is the bearer token, which is something that we're going to need for subsequent calls to the Graph API. I also got an expiration data in over there, and I just do that as a matter of course. I have run some long-running processes against Azure. So the bearer token has a default lifetime of an hour. It will expire, which requires you to renew. So if I'm running one of those longer methods, then I will go off and renew the token. That's just shown over there. You don't necessarily need it. Then I gave some examples over there of reading the authentication, presetting, the URL for the user. So it's basic straight text substitution in that where I'm getting the username and just substituting it in so that the username is contained inside the URL. That squiggly bracket 0 parameter is just substituted. So it's fairly straightforward. We have the 2 endpoints here for getting the getting all the graph authentication methods, and one for looking at the phone methods only. So it's useful in reporting. And just waiting for the screen to catch up here. Okay, so here we put it all together. So we'll get we'll have at the top, we'll just get the graph bearer token. We'll parse that out. We'll then make a call. And then we'll get the URL, we'll get the URI, updated with the username. We'll make a call off to Azure with the invoke REST method over there. And then we're going to get a collection of all the authentication methods that are in the user. So we'll just loop through them in the for each, extract the ones that we're interested in. Just as we can read information from the API, we can also set it. And here's an example where we're going to set some of the authentication, set an authentication method on the user. In this case, we're going to add a mobile phone number, and you'll see in that body where I convert to JSON is basically that's setting the parameters that we set in Graph and passing that on up to the method using invoke REST method in PowerShell. So it's somewhat familiar. And oh yeah, here I do a try catch block, which is useful for catching errors, because as we've learned, not everything will succeed. Okay, and now we're going to give a quick introduction to the Microsoft Graph PowerShell module, which is a newer way of doing things. It's very nice. Microsoft has been investing heavily in the Graph PowerShell modules, and I'll say modules because it is designed to manage everything that's up in Azure. And you know, in particular, we can, if we want to manage the authentication methods, we have individual calls to Graph endpoint into Graph, which basically manages the URL, abstracts a lot of the parameters that we would have to add. Once you've connected, it takes care of managing your bearer token for you. So it does make things a little simpler. Challenges with Graph PowerShell is most of it will require a newer version of PowerShell. So all of our all of our Windows operating systems currently ship with PowerShell 5.1. So that'll be Windows Server 2016, 2019, and 2022. The newer version of PowerShell, I'm making use of the cross-platform modules that we'll know as core. So I'll call it the graph.core. In order to use graph.core and to make it really easy, you should consider installing PowerShell version 7 on the systems. And PowerShell 7 will run on all side by side on all the versions of the platform you had. So everything you have, PowerShell 5 would still run. You'd have to specifically open up PowerShell 7 in another command window. To install to install Microsoft Graph, what you want to do is you want to use the install module command that's available there. Scoping it, you can go to current users, or you can go to all users. And then with the same module, you will, to update it, you will just run an update module command, and that will go off and get the latest versions of everything available from the PowerShell gallery. It's a relatively new thing, but most of us are familiar because we probably have to install lots of newer PowerShell modules, even in 5.1. The PowerShell SDK is what we'll be installing with the Graph, and it comes with a large number of modules. It's something to pay attention to, because if you load all the modules at once, you may run out of function space. So you really want to just load the individual modules that you need. We'd be looking at security, identity, functionality here as well. So I just want to show you the complexity. So with the update module, there are lots of versions that are potentially installed, and I've been playing with it over time, and I had like 4 different versions that were installed simultaneously, and somewhere along the line, some internal links got confused, so I literally had to manually uninstall the modules one at a time. Yes, it was painful, and then I could just reinstall again, and everything was put together with only the latest module installed. The install method is preferable. You can download zip files to install PowerShell modules, and you may have cases like that where your server can't talk to the internet. So if that's the case, that would be one way to deploy. Of course, you lose the ability to update and maintain, although not necessarily important. Okay. So here is just an example of running some of the new commands, and it does seem to be everything here is pretty much a one-liner. So basically, we just import a method, we set some parameters, and then we just go off and call a one-liner PowerShell, in this case, new MG user authentication phone method, and we give it the user's name and the body of what we want to do, and then we'll go set. Note that the new method, there is no like add method. You get a new method, which is like an add if something did exist, if there was a authentication phone method previously registered, then we would get an error. So we'd have to do an update, or you can even do a delete and then add, which is sometimes useful. Likewise, just as we set everything with the telephone method, we also have the ability to set the email address as well. And again, user can only have one email address, so you would get the same kind of error. You would have to do the update command in order to modify it. Fortunately, these are things that don't change often. It's kind of a set, and we can forget. Users don't change their mobile phone numbers very often, since they don't have to any longer. And likewise, email addresses doesn't come in. Here's an example of updating the email method, which I discussed earlier. So this would be whatever method was there should get replaced with the address that I'm giving. Let me go back 2 slides to the we did set the temporary access pass there, and I'll come back to that slide in a moment. But it is a way of just setting up the temporary access pass. Whoops. Hang on. I got to go back over here a minute. Okay. So here on the update authentication phone method, there is one parameter that is needed over here, and we have it's this phone authentication method. It doesn't take plain text, which is rather unfortunate. It does require use of those GUIDs, which gets a bit awkward. I have struggled with that one, and I've had a little bit of problems with it. And that's the end of the presentation. I apologize because there's quite a bit of lag at my end on what I'm presenting. So if anybody has any questions, please enter them in the chat, and we'll do what we can to answer any. But again, I've got 2 customers that are using this right now, if you want to know in practice, and both of them are just registering their the phone numbers and the email address. They are interested in exploring the SMS-based method where we don't have to give a username, but they don't feel comfortable with that right now. The nice part is once a user is onboarded, you could just send out a mail and say, hey, this is your username, go to this link, click forgot password and follow the instructions, and the users will just sit there. They'll update their password. Sorry, they won't update, they'll reset their password. They'll have a new password, so no one ever needs to know what the original password was, what I'll call the initial password. And they're very happy with that now. It simplifies the introduction email quite a bit. They are looking at the SMS method because they just say go to Azure, log into Azure, enter your mobile phone number, and we'll come in and get. And again, they can achieve the initial piece of resetting their password.